The old gas stove hissed. A ring of weak blue flames sputtered to life under the blackened kettle. I watched it, my knuckles white on the chipped countertop. It was the third time I'd tried to light the damn thing this morning. The kettle, the stove, this entire house. It was all a collection of failures held together by rust and memory. Mine, mostly. I spooned instant coffee crystals into a mug that smelled of dust. 2 heaping spoonfuls. Not because I liked it strong, but because the bitterness was a welcome distraction. It was a flavor I could control. "Come on, you piece of junk," I muttered to the kettle. The flame flickered, threatening to die again. Outside, a low wind moaned through the pines that crowded the property, their branches like skeletal fingers scraping against the roof. It was a sound I was getting used to, a constant, lonely murmur that filled the spaces where my own thoughts grew too loud. That's when I heard it. Thud. A soft, dull impact. I froze, spoon halfway to the mug. I held my breath, listening past the hissing stove and the whining wind. Nothing. Just the house settling, the wind pushing a loose branch against the siding. It had to be a branch. I let out my breath, a shaky, tired sound. I was jittery, my nerves frayed thin from too little sleep and too much driving. Too much everything. I finished making my coffee, the scalding water turning the brown crystals into a murky sludge. I leaned against the counter, the warmth of the mug a small comfort against my cold hands. The wind picked up, rattling a window pane somewhere in the living room. I took a sip of the coffee. It was awful. Tap, 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 tap. This time, it was not a branch. It wasn't the wind. It was sharp, deliberate. On the front door. A rhythm. A cadence drilled into the deepest, most terrified part of my brain. A beat from a song I had tried for a year to forget. The one that was on the radio. The one that was playing right at the moment the world came apart in a screech of metal and a shower of glass. The mug slipped from my grasp. It didn't shatter. It was too thick, too cheap. It hit the linoleum floor with a heavy, wet thud, splashing dark liquid across my worn boots. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, wild drumbeat that fought against the one I'd just heard. The memory was a physical thing, a phantom impact against my own body. The jolt. The sudden, lurching stop. My hand, shaking now, reached for the stove. I twisted the knob hard to the right. The blue flame vanished with a soft woof. The only sound left was the wind and the blood roaring in my ears. "No," I whispered to the empty kitchen. "No fucking way." It was a prank. It had to be. Some local kids who saw the lights on in the old, abandoned house and decided to have some fun. That's what it was. Anger began to bubble up hot and fast, a welcome shield against the cold thing coiling in my gut. I stomped out of the kitchen, my boots smacking against the wooden floorboards, the sound echoing through the house. I didn't bother turning on the hall light. I knew the way. I put my eye to the peephole. The glass was clouded, distorting the world outside into a warped fish-eye lens. I saw the overgrown yard, the gravel driveway, the dark wall of trees beyond it. I saw the porch swing moving slightly in the wind. I saw no one. No car, no footprints in the damp earth that I could make out. Rage boiled over. I undid the deadbolt, a loud metallic clack, and wrenched the door open. "You think this is funny?" I yelled into the morning gloom. My voice sounded thin, swallowed by the vastness of the woods. The porch was empty. The yard was empty. The only movement was the swaying of the pines, and the gentle rocking of the porch swing. I stood there for a long moment, the cold air biting at my skin, a fool shouting at ghosts. I felt the anger drain away, leaving behind only the familiar, hollow ache. I was losing my mind. That was the only explanation. The guilt was finally eating me from the inside out, making me hear things, making me see. I stepped back inside and slammed the door shut. The house shuddered from the force. The sound of the slam was still ringing in the air when it came again. Thump, 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 thump. It was not on the door, it was in the door, right in front of my face. Muffled, deep, as if the wood itself had a heartbeat. A sick, familiar heartbeat. A strangled noise escaped my throat. I stumbled back, my hand flying up to my mouth. My eyes were locked on the solid oak panel in front of me. It was impossible. It couldn't be happening. I saw the brass knob. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get out, to go anywhere but here. But another, more powerful impulse took over. I needed to see. I needed to prove I was wrong. I lunged forward and grabbed the doorknob. I twisted. Nothing. It didn't budge. Not a millimeter. It was as if the deadbolt had been thrown, but I was the one who had unlocked it. I saw the bolt, sitting flush in its housing. It was open. I pulled harder, my fingers slipping on the cold metal. I braced my foot against the wall and threw my weight into it. The door was a solid, unmoving wall of wood. It was stuck, locked, sealed. Panic, pure and undiluted, flooded my system. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. "Open!" I grunted, pulling with all my strength. My muscles screamed in protest. The wood didn't even creak. It was fused shut. I was trapped in here with the sound. Thump, 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 thump. It was right there, on the other side of a single inch of wood. A patient, relentless rhythm. It wasn't angry. It wasn't violent. It was just there. A statement of fact. A reminder. I am here. I know you're in there. I know the song. I let go of the knob and scrambled backward, my boots slipping on the dusty floor. My back hit the opposite wall of the narrow hallway. I slid down to the floor, my eyes wide, fixed on the door. I couldn't tear them away. This wasn't guilt. This wasn't my imagination. A door doesn't seal itself shut. A sound doesn't come from inside solid oak. A new wave of feeling washed over me, displacing the panic. It was a raw, primal fury. I wasn't going to be toyed with. Not here, not now. I had run to this place to be left alone, to rot in my own misery, and I wouldn't let some thing, some trick, take even that from me. I got to my feet. My body was trembling, but my mind was a point of white-hot focus. The door. I had to get through the door. I took 3 steps back, the length of the narrow hallway. I didn't shout. I didn't think. I ran. My shoulder hit the wood just to the right of the doorknob. There was a sound like a rifle shot, the splintering of the door jamb. The door flew inward, torn from its lock, and slammed against the interior wall with a deafening crash. The momentum carried me through. I tripped over the threshold and went down hard, my hands scraping against the rough porch planks, my hip connecting with a solid jolt. Pain flared up my arm, hot and sharp. I lay there for a second, gasping, the coppery taste of dust and blood in my mouth from biting my tongue. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees. My shoulders screamed. I looked back inside. The hallway was dark. The door I had just broken hung crookedly on one hinge. The knocking was gone. The only sound was my own ragged breathing, and the ever-present wind. I was outside. I was free. I could just run, get in my car and drive, and never ever look back. But I had to look. I crawled back to the threshold, my body aching. I peered into the dim light of the hallway. Everything was as it had been, except for the broken door. Dust motes danced in the sliver of light coming from the kitchen. Then I felt it. My left palm, pressed flat against the dusty floorboards of the entryway, had slid over something, an unevenness in the thick layer of grime. A pattern. I looked down. My hand was covering it. I pulled my hand away, my fingers leaving a clean print in the gray filth, and there, revealed in the space I had just cleared, was a word. It hadn't been there before. I would have seen it. It was traced in the dust, the lines sharp and clear, as if someone had just crouched down and written it with their fingertip. A single word. 4 letters. Run. I stared at the word. R-U-N. The letters were carved into the filth by a steady finger. My handprint, a clean shape against the gray, was a testament to its recent creation. It was a message. A command. My legs felt watery. I pushed myself backward, away from the threshold, my good hand crab-walking me until my back hit the wall. The rough planking scraped my shirt. I sat there, on the floor of the porch I had just broken into, looking back at the dark hallway of the house I had just broken out of. My shoulder throbbed with a deep, pulsating ache. Cold air washed over me, raising bumps on my arms. Run. The word echoed the frantic command in my own blood. Run where? To the car. Drive. Don't stop. Don't look back. It was simple. It was the only sane thing to do. But my body wouldn't obey. A wire had been disconnected between my brain and my limbs. I was anchored here, held fast by a cold, heavy curiosity that was stronger than fear. Who wrote it? The person who knocked? Where were they now? Hiding in the trees, watching me. A flicker of movement in the dark wall of pines made me flinch, but it was only the wind. Always the wind. I couldn't stay out here. The exposure felt worse than the enclosure. Being watched was worse than being trapped. Getting to my feet was a slow, agonizing process. My shoulder protested with a spike of white-hot pain. I leaned against the exterior wall, breathing in short, shallow gasps. I looked at the ruined door, hanging from its top hinge like a broken jaw. An open wound in the side of the house. I couldn't leave it like that. I stepped back over the threshold, my boots crunching on splinters of wood. The word was still there. I didn't look at it. I forced the heavy door back into its frame. It wouldn't close. The lock set was destroyed, the jamb a splintered mess. It hung crooked, leaving a 2-inch gap. It was enough. Enough for a hand. Enough for an eye. There was an old, heavy armchair in the living room. Its upholstery faded and smelling of mothballs. I gritted my teeth against the fire in my shoulder and began to drag it. The chair's feet screamed in protest against the wood floors. The sound was loud, obscene in the tense air. I wedged it against the door, jamming its solid oak arm under the doorknob. It wasn't a lock, but it was something. A barrier, a warning system. No one could move that door now without making a hell of a noise. I stood back, breathing heavily, sweat stinging my eyes. The house was sealed again. I had made my choice. I was staying. Not out of bravery, out of something else. A stubborn refusal to be chased away. I ran here to escape a memory. I wouldn't let a new one hunt me out of this place too. The silence returned, heavier now that I had fortified my position. It was a listening silence. I could feel it pressing in on me from the dark corners of the house, from the spaces behind the walls. I needed a noise. Any noise. Something to fill the void. Something to prove I was the only one making sounds in here. My eyes landed on the living room. It was a tomb of discarded furniture, shrouded in white cloths like tiny ghosts. In the corner, on a small, rickety end table, sat a radio. An old thing from the 40s, maybe. A curved wooden box, with a big, cloth-covered speaker and a single, yellowed dial. Dust lay thick on its rounded shoulders. I walked toward it, my steps deliberate. I wiped the dust from the plug with my thumb and found a socket in the wall behind the table. I pushed it in. Nothing happened. The bakelite dial felt cool and brittle under my fingers. I twisted it. A low crackle broke the silence, followed by a steady, rushing hiss. Static. I closed my eyes and let the sound wash over me. It was meaningless. A wall of white noise. It was perfect. It was a sound I could understand. It was the sound of nothing. At least it's a noise, I whispered, and the sound of my own voice was a small shock. I left it on, a low roar filling the room, and went back to the kitchen. My coffee was a cold, dark puddle on the floor. I ignored it. I found a glass, rinsed the dust out of it, and filled it with water from the tap. It tasted of iron and rust, but it was wet. I leaned against the counter, drinking, letting the static from the other room be my shield. I listened to it for a long, long time. The hiss and pop of a dead frequency. The sound of a world that wasn't speaking to me. Then, through the static, something else happened. It wasn't a change in the static itself. It was a shape within the noise. A pattern. A thread of sound, so faint I thought I was creating it myself. I set the glass down. I cocked my head, listening. The hiss continued, but now there was something woven into it. A whisper, shredded by the interference. T-H, H, H, Anne. I straightened up, my muscles tight. It was a radio signal, breaking through. Someone's voice from a distant station, snagged for a moment before being lost again. That's all it was. I walked back into the living room, my heart starting a slow, heavy beat against my ribs. I stood in front of the radio, listening to the shapeless noise. It was gone. Just static again. I reached out and put my hand on the dial. I would find a different frequency, a clearer one, or just turn it off. My fingers touched the knob, then it was closer this time, sharper. I snatched my hand back as if the radio were hot. It was a voice. A woman's voice. I wasn't imagining it. my breath caught in my throat. I stared at the cloth speaker grill, at the intricate pattern of the fabric. The voice was coming from there. From inside that box. Slowly, I turned the dial. A fraction of an inch to the left. The static shifted pitch, becoming higher, thinner. Nothing. I turned it to the right. The hiss deepened into a rumbling growl. And then I heard it again, cleaved from the noise. Almost clean. Run! The word hung in the air for a second before being swallowed again by the static. It was the same word. The same command. Not angry, not threatening. It was desperate. A plea. A cold wave rolled through my gut. My hand, shaking, shot out and gripped the plug. I yanked it from the wall socket. The static cut out instantly. The silence that crashed down was absolute. It was a physical weight. I stood frozen, my knuckles white around the useless plug, listening to the blood pounding in my ears. It was over. A freak signal. A coincidence of words that my panicked mind had stitched together. It was over. From the radio, the voice came again. There was no static, no hiss. It was clear. A pure, clean sound in the dead air of the room. A woman's voice, filled with an agony that scraped at the inside of my skull. It's listening. I dropped the plug. It hit the floor with a tiny, insignificant clatter. Every hair on my body stood on end. The air in front of my face turned to smoke. My own breath. Plumbing in a sudden, impossible cold. The room's temperature had plummeted. It was like standing in a walk-in freezer. The chill sank into my bones, a deep, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the weather. The radio was unplugged. The radio was speaking. It couldn't be. It couldn't. My mind broke. The careful, fragile barrier of denial I had built around myself shattered into a million pieces. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a stray signal. This was something else. Something wrong. A noise tore from my throat. A wild animal sound of pure negation. My gaze was locked on the wooden box. The source. The vessel for that voice. It was a smiling, malevolent thing in the corner of the room. My hand closed around the radio's curved top. The wood was colder than ice. The cold burned my skin. I didn't care. Adrenaline was a furnace in my chest. I screamed, a wordless roar of fury and terror, and I lifted the radio high over my head. My injured shoulder screamed, but the rage was a fire that burned the pain away. With all the strength I had, I threw it. It flew across the room and hit the opposite wall. The sound of the impact was a wet crack, a sickening finality. The wooden case exploded like a dry skull. Splinters and shards of bakelite rained down onto the floor. The glass dial cover sprayed across the floorboards in a glittering arc. Wires and tubes, the machine's guts, were thrown from the wreckage. Silence came back. I stood there, my chest heaving, my body trembling. I stared at the devastation, the chair, the wall, the floor, all littered with the debris of the dead radio. It was done. I had destroyed it. I had silenced the voice. I took a shaky step forward, then another. I looked down at the ruin. A tangled mess of copper wire, the shattered vacuum tubes, the speaker, its cloth cone ripped open, facing the ceiling. From the center of that ripped cone, from the black magnet at its heart, a thin ribbon of smoke began to rise. It wasn't the smoke of a fire. It was black. A strand of oily darkness, impossibly thin, like a piece of thread being pulled upward. It didn't dissipate. It twisted and coiled in the cold air, a slow, deliberate dance. It rose about 3 feet, held its shape for a long moment, and then dissolved into nothing. I knelt down, my knees pressing into shards of glass I didn't feel. I leaned closer to the wreckage. The smoke was gone, but it had left something behind. A smell. It wasn't the smell of burnt plastic or hot electronics. It was the smell of rich, dark soil after a hard rain. The smell of a freshly turned grave. The smell lingered. Rich, dark earth. It clung to the air in the living room, a ghost of the radio's final, unnatural exhalation. I left the wreckage on the floor, a monument to my capitulation. I had fought back, and in doing so had admitted there was something to fight. My shoulder was a hot coal embedded in my flesh. Each breath stoked the embers. I made my way up the creaking staircase, one hand on the railing, pulling my dead weight. Sleep wasn't a choice. It was a collapse I was stumbling toward. The bedroom was at the end of the hall. The door hung open. The bed was a pale rectangle in the wash of moonlight filtering through the grimy window pane. It looked like a slab in a morgue. I didn't bother with the lights. I didn't want to see the peeling wallpaper or the water stains on the ceiling that looked like old maps of forgotten countries. I stripped down to my boxers. The simple act an enormous effort. The cool air touched my skin. I crawled under the thin blanket, the sheets feeling stiff and cold, smelling faintly of dust and time. Lying on my back, my good arm folded behind my head, I stared at the ceiling. The pain in my shoulder was a steady, heavy rhythm, a drumbeat for the frantic symphony in my head. Run! It's listening. The smell of a grave. It was a loop of nonsense, a fever dream brought on by stress and isolation. The old house was playing tricks on me, and my guilt was the perfect accomplice. I ran from one ghost only to invent another. It had to be that. It was the only explanation that allowed for a next morning. I closed my eyes. I focused on the pain in my shoulder, a real thing. A physical anchor in a sea of mental debris. Breathe in, feel the fire. Breathe out, let it go. Repeat. That's when I heard it. A faint scratching sound. It was quiet. So quiet I could only hear it in the space between my heartbeats. A tiny dry skittering from inside the wall to my left. Mice, I told myself. The word was a shield. The house was old, half-rotted. Of course there were mice. They were a part of the decay, a natural component of a place like this. It was a good sound. A sound of life, however small and unwelcome. It was better than the voice from the unplugged radio. I tried to let the sound fade into the background, to accept it as part of the house's nocturnal pulse. But it wouldn't fade. It continued. A persistent, irritating whisper of movement. I rolled onto my good side, turning my back to the wall, pulling the blanket up to my ear. It didn't help. The sound seemed to travel through the mattress, through my bones. Then, the quality of the sound changed. It was no longer the frantic, random scrabble of a small animal. The rhythm became slower, more deliberate. A dry, scraping noise. It was the sound of a fingernail being dragged across a rough, plaster surface. A long, slow scratch. A pause. Another scratch. It moved, with a terrifying purpose. It started near the floor and began to climb the inside of the wall, moving parallel to my body. My breath hitched. My muscles went rigid. This wasn't a mouse. Mice don't climb in straight, methodical lines. They don't make sounds full of intention. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Higher now. Level with the mattress. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Level with my chest. I lay perfectly still, a statue of flesh and bone. Every nerve ending was on fire, trained on that sound. It scraped its way higher and higher, a slow, patient ascent up the interior of the wall. Finally, it stopped. The silence it left behind was a high-pitched scream in my ears. I knew, with a certainty that turned my blood to ice water, exactly where it had stopped. Right behind the headboard. Directly behind my head. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was prey, frozen in the hunter's gaze. A minute passed. 2. The silence stretched, becoming thin and brittle, ready to snap. I had to know. I had to be sure. Slowly, fighting the tremor in my hand, I pushed the blanket away. I rolled onto my back, then eased myself into a sitting position, my back pressed against the headboard. The wood was cold against my bare skin. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I held my breath, tilted my head, and pressed my ear against the wall. The plaster was cold, almost damp. I heard nothing but the rush of blood in my own ear. I waited. Was it gone? Had I imagined the whole thing? Was this the breaking point? The moment my mind finally snapped the leash of. Thump. The sound was a physical blow. It wasn't just a noise. It was a concussion that slammed through the wall, through my skull and into the center of my brain. It was as if a wrecking ball, swung from inside the wall, had struck the exact spot where my ear was pressed. I cried out, a choked yelp of pain and shock, and threw myself away from the source. I tumbled sideways off the bed, landing hard on the floorboards, my bad shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. A sunburst of white agony erupted from the joint, eclipsing all thought. At the exact same instant, the moonlight vanished. The room plunged into absolute black. The power was out. I lay on the floor, gasping, my vision swimming with black spots from the pain. The house was dead. The hum of the refrigerator downstairs was gone. The world had been reduced to the sound of my own ragged breathing, and the frantic pounding in my chest. Darkness pressed in, solid and suffocating. Then, a light. On the nightstand beside the bed, my phone screen blazed to life. A single, sharp rectangle of stark white light in the crushing blackness. It illuminated the corner of the pillow, the edge of the wooden nightstand, a layer of dust. It was an impossible beacon. A new message had arrived. My body refused to move. Stay on the floor. Stay in the dark. Don't look. The command screamed through my mind. But the light was a hook, and it was already in me. It pulled. Getting up was a clumsy, agonizing sequence of movements. I used my good arm to push myself into a kneeling position. My teeth gritted against the fire in my shoulder. The floorboards were cold under my knees. I reached for the nightstand, my hand shaking so violently I almost knocked the phone to the floor. My fingers closed around it. The screen was cool. The notification was for a text message. From a number I didn't recognize. An unknown number. My thumb hovered over the screen. This was a line. I knew it. Once I crossed it, there was no going back. I could throw the phone against the far wall, just like the radio. I could crawl into the corner and wait for the sun to rise. I opened the message. It wasn't text. It was a picture. An image, downloading itself onto the screen in the pitch-dark room. A bar crawled slowly from left to right. My heart kept pace with it. The image resolved. I stared. My mind didn't process it at first. It was a photo, tinted with the faint blue tone of moonlight. It showed a man, sleeping. On his back, one arm tucked behind his head. He was vulnerable, his face slack in unconsciousness. He was lying in a bed with a dark wooden headboard. This bed. It was a picture of me. My stomach dropped, a cold, heavy weight falling through my insides. The angle. The horrible, impossible angle. It was taken from above. Directly above. From the corner of the ceiling, looking down, and at the bottom of the screen, beneath the image of my sleeping, helpless body, was a small, gray text. The timestamp. Sent. Just now. A noise came out of my throat. It wasn't a word. It was a sound of pure animal terror, a sound I had never made before. I threw the phone. It hit the floor, and the screen went dark. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, away from the bed, my mind a white-hot blank of panic. I hit the doorframe. I fumbled for the knob, found it, and wrenched the door open. I fell out into the hallway, slamming the bedroom door shut behind me. The sound of the latch clicking into place was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I was in the hall. It was as black as the room I just fled. I needed light. I needed to see. The wall felt slick with cold sweat under my searching palm. Where was the switch? My fingers slid over smooth plaster. A door frame. More plaster. There. A small plastic rectangle. I flipped it. Nothing. The power was still out. Of course the power was still out. A breaker box. Downstairs. In the kitchen. I half ran, half stumbled down the stairs. One hand trailing along the wall to guide me. My bare feet slapping against the old wood. I didn't care about the noise. I was the noise. I burst into the kitchen, the room only slightly less dark thanks to the large window over the sink. I found the metal door of the breaker box next to the pantry. I yanked it open. Inside was a row of black switches. One of them, labeled upstairs, was flipped down. It hadn't tripped, it had been flipped. Manually. With a shaking finger, I pushed it back up. Light flooded the hallway upstairs. A raw, yellow glare that spilled down the stairwell. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, my chest heaving, my body trembling. The light was a weapon. The light was safety. I took a deep, shuddering breath and started back up, my fear turning to a cold, hard knot of rage. My eyes were fixed on the closed bedroom door at the end of the hall. The door I had just slammed shut. I reached the top of the landing. The bare bulb in the ceiling cast long, distorted shadows. I stared at the door, at its flat, white-painted surface. It wasn't flat anymore. There were marks on it. On the outside. On the hallway side. The side that had been facing me. 3 long, parallel gouges were carved into the wood. They started near the top of the door and dragged down about 3 feet, ending in splintered, curling strips of paint and wood. They were deep. Vicious. They looked like they had been made by something enormous. Something powerful. Something trying to claw its way out. But that was wrong. I was the one who had just come out. The door was closed. Whatever made those marks had to have been in the hallway. With me. In the dark. No, I looked again, my brain struggling to connect the pieces. The scream. The fall from the bed. The scramble across the floor. The flight into the hall. The slam of the door. The marks were on this side. They weren't claw marks trying to get out of the room. I stared at the raw, splintered wood, and a new, more terrible understanding dawned. They were marks left by something that had been clawing to get in. I stared at the gouges in the door. My brain refused to process the information. The light from the bare bulb in the hallway ceiling was harsh, turning everything yellow and sick. It cast my shadow long and thin behind me, a dark twin stretching back down the stairs. The raw, splintered wood of the marks stood out against the peeling white paint. They were fresh. The wood inside the grooves was pale, almost wet-looking. In the hallway. With me. In the dark. The thought was a shard of ice in my gut. While I had been fumbling for the light switch, my back to this door, something had been here. Something with enough strength to tear through solid wood. Something that had been trying to get into the room I had just locked myself out of. No, that wasn't right. It was trying to get in after I had already come out. I backed away slowly, one step at a time. My bare feet made no sound on the floorboards. My eyes were fixed on the door, on the violation carved into its surface. I couldn't go back in there. I could never go back in there. But the alternative was to stay in this hallway, where the thing with the claws had just been standing. A tremor started in my hands. I looked down at them. They were shaking. My whole body was shaking. The pain in my shoulder was a distant, secondary concern. A dull fire eclipsed by the inferno of pure terror that was consuming me. I had to move. I couldn't stay here, a target under this single, naked bulb. I turned and went down the stairs, my movements stiff and robotic. I didn't run. Running felt like an admission of being chased. I descended with a measured, deliberate pace, my good hand gripping the railing so tightly my knuckles were white. The wood of the railing was smooth and cool. A real thing. Solid. I focused on the feel of it. The living room was a pit of shadows beyond the reach of the upstairs light. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I couldn't see anything in the gloom. The couch. The armchair. The dead radio. Still in pieces on the floor where I'd thrown it. The breaker box was in the kitchen. I could turn on the downstairs lights, but I didn't want to go into the kitchen. The kitchen had a large window. A black mirror looking out into the night. I didn't want to see my own reflection in it. I didn't want to see what might be standing behind me. I chose the armchair. It was the farthest thing from the windows and the front door. It sat in the deepest part of the shadows, its back to the staircase. It was a lumpy, oversized relic with worn-out fabric that felt like old flannel against my skin. I sank into it. The springs groaned in protest. I pulled my legs up, folding myself into the chair, trying to make myself as small as possible. I was still just in my boxers. The air was cold on my bare skin. Goosebumps prickled my arms and legs. I sat there and listened. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that follows a loud noise. A waiting quiet. The hum of the refrigerator was back, a low, steady thrum from the kitchen. It was the only sound. I listened for a creak in the floorboards upstairs. A scratch from the walls. Anything. There was nothing, just the machine hum and the rush of my own blood in my ears. My shoulder ached with a deep, pulsating rhythm. I rested my head back against the top of the chair. The fabric smelled of dust and something else. A faint, sweetish odor of decay, like old, damp paper. I closed my eyes. The image of the gouges on the door was burned into the back of my eyelids. 3 long, deep cuts. I couldn't stay awake. My body, pushed past its limits, was shutting down whether I wanted it to or not. My thoughts began to fray at the edges. The terror was still there, a cold stone in my stomach, but it was being wrapped in thick layers of exhaustion. My breathing slowed. The frantic beat of my heart eased into a heavy, tired thump. Sleep wasn't a comfort. It was a failure. It was me giving up, and I couldn't stop it. The familiar scene snapped into focus without preamble. Headlights cutting through a black, rain-slicked road. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the windshield wipers. The radio was playing. A stupid pop song I hated, but I didn't change it. I was just driving. My hands at 10 and 2. The world was a narrow tunnel of light and darkness. Then, a shape at the edge of the tunnel. A flicker of movement. Pale. I didn't have time to process it. My foot slammed on the brake. A useless gesture. The screech of tires on wet asphalt. The sickening final crunch of metal hitting something soft. A sound like a muffled drum. The car swerved. The world tilted and spun. The windshield exploded inward in a shower of tiny, glittering cubes. Glass sprayed across my face and chest. Then, everything stopped. The engine died. The radio died. The only sound was the ticking of the cooling engine and the drip, drip, drip of rain on the roof. I've had this dream 100 times. 1,000. It's my penance. My nightly payment. Usually, this is where I wake up. Sweating and tangled in my sheets, my own choked cry in my ears. But not this time. The scene dissolved. The shattered windshield and the smell of rain and gasoline faded away, replaced by something else. The scent of dust and damp wood. I was standing. My bare feet were on a cold, wooden floor. I was in the living room of the house. The dream logic was seamless. There was no confusion, no sense of transition. I was simply here now. The room was different. Darker. The furniture was covered in a thin layer of fine gray dust. The air was heavy. Wet. Water stained the walls in long, dark streaks, like weeping sores. The peeling wallpaper had started to sag, hanging off the plaster in limp, damp sheets. And she was there. The victim. The shape from the side of the road. She stood by the empty fireplace, where the mantelpiece had rotted and collapsed into a pile of debris. Her clothes were torn and dirty. Her face was a pale oval in the gloom without any expression. A blank slate. Her eyes weren't looking at me. They were fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder. There was no fury in them. No accusation. There was nothing. I tried to speak. To say her name. A name I had learned from a news report and had never allowed myself to forget. To say I was sorry. The words formed in my mind, but my mouth wouldn't work. My jaw was locked. My throat felt like it was packed with cotton. She didn't seem to notice. Her presence was strangely passive, like she was an object, a piece of the room's decay. Slowly she raised her right arm. It moved with a stiff, unnatural motion. She extended her index finger, and she pointed. Not at me. She pointed down. At the floorboards. Directly at my feet. I followed her finger. I looked down. The wooden planks beneath my feet were changing. The grain of the wood was softening, losing its texture. The seams between the boards began to widen, and a dark, wet substance pushed its way up through the gaps. It looked like black mud, thick and oily. It pooled around my ankles, cold and heavy. It wasn't just on the floor, it was coming from the floor. A new smell filled the air, overpowering the scent of dust and rot. It was the smell of rich, wet soil. The smell of an open grave. The mud rose higher. It clung to my calves, its weight pulling me down. I tried to lift my feet, but they were stuck fast. The floor was no longer solid. It had the consistency of quicksand. I thrashed, trying to pull myself free, but my struggles only made me sink faster. The mud was up to my knees now, a cold, foul sheath. I looked back at her, a silent scream building in my chest. Her face was still blank, impassive. She was just watching. She opened her mouth, as if to finally speak, to finally pass judgment. But no words came out. Instead, a thick black liquid poured from her lips. The same oily, dark sludge that was consuming me. It flowed in a steady, silent stream down her chin, onto her clothes, and onto the floor, where it joined the rising tide. She wasn't speaking. She was overflowing. The mud reached my waist. The pressure was immense. I felt a rib creak. I fought for breath. My silent scream trapped in my lungs. My vision started to tunnel. The last thing I saw before the blackness took me was her face, still blank, still empty as the house pulled me under. I woke with a violent jerk that sent a spike of white-hot agony through my shoulder. A sound, a raw gasp, was torn from my throat. I was in the armchair. My heart was hammering, a wild animal trying to break out of my chest. I was drenched in a cold sweat. My hands were balled into fists, my nails digging into my palms. The room was dark. The hum of the refrigerator was a steady drone. I was safe. It was a dream. Just another nightmare. Worse than usual, but still, just a dream. The relief was so profound it felt like a physical blow. I took a deep, shuddering breath, then another. The air tasted stale. My feet were cold. The thought cut through the post-nightmare haze. It wasn't the ambient chill of the room. It was a deep, wet cold. It felt exactly like it had in the dream. I stayed frozen for a long moment, listening to the frantic beat of my own heart. Don't look down. The command was primal. If you don't look, it's not real. But I couldn't stop myself. The curiosity was a sickness, more powerful than the fear. I slowly, carefully uncurled my body. I planted my hands on the arms of the chair to push myself up. The fabric under my palms was damp. My stomach twisted. I leaned forward, peering over the edge of the seat into the darkness at my feet. There was a patch of something on the floor, a shape darker than the surrounding shadows. A wet sheen reflected the faint light coming down the stairs. My hand fumbled at my side, searching for my phone. It wasn't there. I'd thrown it in the bedroom. I had no light. I had to be sure. I lowered my good arm, my fingers outstretched, my hand trembling. I reached down into the darkness beside the chair. The tips of my fingers brushed against the floorboards. They were slick, cold, wet. I drew my hand back as if I'd touched a hot stove. I looked at my fingers. They were coated in a dark, grimy film that smelled of damp earth and rot. The smell from the dream. A new wave of cold dread washed over me. So intense it made me feel nauseous. This wasn't sweat. This wasn't a spilled drink I'd forgotten about. I had to see. Using the chair for support, I pushed myself to my feet. The fire in my shoulder screamed, but I ignored it. I took a staggering step away from the chair, my bare feet landing on dry floorboards. The contrast was immediate and shocking. I turned and looked back. It was a puddle. A large, irregular puddle spread out on the floor, centered right where my feet had been. It had soaked into the old wood, staining it a dark, ugly brown. It wasn't clear water. It was murky, opaque, with small, dark specks floating in it. Bits of dirt. Debris. In the dim light, it looked like a black wound on the floor of the house. A wound that was still weeping. I stared at it. My mind tried to find an explanation. A leak from the roof? No, the ceiling above was dry. A burst pipe under the floor? Maybe. But why here? Why now? Why did it smell exactly like the mud in my dream? Why was it only in this one spot, perfectly encircling the place I had chosen to sleep? I hadn't spilled anything. I hadn't brought anything to drink in here. I had come downstairs and collapsed into the chair. That was all. There was no source for this water. It had simply appeared. It was a scar on the house. A physical mark left behind by a nightmare. Proof. It was proof that the barrier between my dreams and this place was gone. The thing that had clawed the door, the thing that had sent the picture, the thing that had pulled me under in my sleep. It wasn't just haunting my mind anymore. It was here. It was real. And it was leaving traces of itself behind. The first light of day was a dirty gray film on the windows. It did nothing to warm the room. My body was a roadmap of aches. The deep, throbbing fire in my shoulder was the capital city. But every muscle was a town in rebellion. I was stiff, coiled into a knot in the oversized armchair. The cold had settled deep in my bones. I pushed myself up. My joints creaked in protest. The pain in my shoulder made my vision flash white for a second. I stood, unsteady on my feet, and looked at the floor. The dark patch was still there. It had soaked deeper into the wood, the edges now a blurry water stain around a central, darker heart. The air still held the faint, cloying scent of a freshly dug hole, of wet dirt and things that should have stayed buried. My mind recoiled from it, tried to build walls of logic. A leak. It had to be a leak. An old house. A burst pipe under the floor. It was the only explanation that didn't make my skin crawl. The only one that let me breathe. I took a step, then another. The rest of the floorboards were dry. I walked a wide circle around the stain, my eyes fixed on it. A physical remnant of a nightmare, a souvenir from a place I never wanted to visit again. The house was silent. The refrigerator had cycled off. The absence of its low hum made the silence feel heavier, more deliberate. I listened for the scratching from upstairs. Nothing. I listened for a footstep. Nothing. I had to get to the bathroom. I had to wash my face. I had to see myself in a mirror and confirm that I was still me, that I was solid and real, and that the thing from the dream, the thing that left puddles on the floor, was not. The walk up the stairs felt like a mile. Each step was a conscious effort. I kept my good hand on the railing, my eyes scanning the shadows at the top of the landing. The door to my bedroom stood ajar, the deep gouges in the wood like 3 gaping mouths. I didn't look at them for long. The bathroom door was closed. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the tarnished brass knob. Was it in there? Was it waiting? What a fucking question. It wasn't real. It was stress. It was guilt. It was a bad wire in my head. I forced the thought down. I turned the knob. The latch clicked loudly in the silence. I pushed the door open. The bathroom was small and empty. A faint light filtered through the frosted glass of the small window. A toilet, a sink, a shower, with a stained plastic curtain. Everything was coated in a thin layer of grime. The air smelled of mildew and old plumbing. I stepped inside, leaving the door open behind me. I needed the escape route. I faced the sink. The mirror above it was large, but the silvering had started to decay around the edges, creating a dark, creeping border like a disease. The glass was flecked with something. Old toothpaste, probably. My reflection was a gray, haggard shape. Dark circles under my eyes, a 2-day stubble on my jaw. My hair was a mess. I looked like a ghost. You're okay. I mouthed the words, my own voice a foreign concept. You're just tired. The reflection stared back, its expression grim. It didn't look convinced. I leaned forward, my hands gripping the cold porcelain of the sink. You're just tired, I whispered this time, the sound a dry rasp in my throat. I needed to believe it. I needed this to be a place of reason, a world governed by pipes and wood and gravity, not by other things. I turned on the cold tap. The pipes shuddered and groaned, then spat out a stream of rusty water that slowly cleared. I cupped my hands and splashed the cold water onto my face. The shock was sharp, immediate. It felt good. Real. I did it again, scrubbing at my eyes, trying to wash away the residue of the nightmare. The cold water dripped from my chin and down my bare chest. I took a breath and looked up. For a single sickening beat of my heart, the face in the mirror was not my own. It was hers. The girl from the road. Sunken cheeks, pale skin stretched tight over bone. Eyes that were not eyes but dark, empty holes. Her mouth was a slack, black O of shock. It was the face of someone who had seen the end. It was there for no more than a second, a single frame spliced into the film of my reality. I flinched back, a strangled noise caught in my throat. I blinked hard. Once. Twice, my own face stared back at me. Wet. Pale. My eyes wide with a terror I couldn't hide. It had been a trick of the light. A trick of the water on my face. A trick of a mind strained to its breaking point. It had to be. I didn't move. I just stared. My heart a frantic, panicked bird beating against my ribs. I stared at my reflection, daring it to change again. My breath came in shallow, ragged bursts. The face in the mirror was still. It was just me. Tired, scared, pathetic me. Then, slowly, the reflection's lips peeled back from its teeth. It was a smile. A slow, wide, predatory smile that I was not making. I stood frozen, my own face a mask of horror, while the man in the mirror grinned at me. It was a knowing look. A conspiratorial look. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. The smile didn't reach its eyes. The eyes remained wide, fixed on mine. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I was pinned by the sight of my own face, twisted into a grotesque parody. The mouth of my reflection moved, forming a shape without sound, a single, silent word that I read on its lips. Walls. And at that exact moment I heard it. It started behind me, from the wall behind the toilet. A faint, dry, scratching sound. The sound of fingernails dragging through plaster. Scrape. 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 It was the same sound from the other night. It was inside the wall, patient and persistent. It wasn't just in my head. The man in the mirror had told me where to listen, and now the sound was there, proving him right. My paralysis broke. The fear gave way to a surge of adrenaline so powerful it felt like an electric shock. I was supposed to run. I was supposed to get out of the house, but I couldn't tear my eyes from the mirror. The expression on my reflection's face changed again. The hideous smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, abject terror. Its eyes widened, no longer looking at me, but through me. At something over my shoulder. Something behind me. In the room. With me. Its mouth fell open, not to speak, but in a silent scream. Its hand, my hand, flew up, its finger extended, pointing, desperately, urgently, pointing past my head, into the small, grimy space between my back and the wall. A cold weight settled on my right shoulder. It wasn't heavy. It was a firm, deliberate pressure, like a hand gripping me. I felt the distinct shape of 5 fingers pressing into the fabric of my t-shirt, the cold of them seeping through to my skin. A damp, cellar cold. The smell of the puddle downstairs, the smell of rot and rich soil, filled my nostrils, thick and immediate. Time stopped. My breath locked in my lungs. The scratching in the wall stopped. The only sound was the frantic drumming of blood in my ears. I could feel the individual points of pressure on my shoulder. A thumb near my collarbone. 4 fingers wrapping over the peak of my shoulder blade. I screamed. It wasn't a word. It was a raw animal sound of pure terror, ripped from the deepest part of me. The sound shattered the silence of the bathroom. It was my voice, but it felt like it belonged to someone else. My body reacted on its own. I spun around, my good arm flailing wildly, a backhanded swing aimed at the thing that was touching me. My fist connected with nothing but air. The bathroom was empty. There was no one there. The space behind me was vacant. The stained shower curtain hung limp and still. The door was still open to the hallway. Nothing had moved. Nothing was there. I stood panting, my back to the mirror, my eyes darting into every corner. My heart felt like it was going to explode. My skin was on fire where the hand had been. A phantom sensation of cold and pressure that refused to fade. It wasn't real. It couldn't have been real. It was a hallucination. A touch hallucination. My mind was breaking. It was finally, completely breaking apart. I turned back to the sink, my body trembling so violently my teeth chattered. I needed to see my own, normal, terrified face in the mirror to prove that I was alone again. I braced my hands on the sink, my knuckles were white. I looked up. The reflection was just my own. Pale. Wide-eyed. Its mouth was hanging open. Alone. But on the shoulder of my gray t-shirt, where the hand had been, there was a mark. It was perfect. Unmistakable. The distinct, clear imprint of a hand. 5 fingers and a palm, rendered in a smear of wet, black filth. It looked like someone had dipped their hand in thick, dark mud, and then pressed it firmly against me. I could see the texture in it. Gritty, clumpy, with tiny bits of what looked like organic matter stuck in the fabric. It was damp. A dark wet patch was already spreading into the cotton around the edges of the print. It was the same substance as the puddle downstairs. The same substance from the dream. I stared, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. This wasn't a trick of the light. This wasn't a figment of my imagination. This was physical. This was real. This was a stain. A scar left on me by an invisible hand. It had touched me. It had marked me. And the proof was right there, on my shoulder, a black handprint from a place that wasn't supposed to exist. I backed away from the mirror. 1 step. Then another. My bare feet were clumsy on the cold tile. My eyes were locked on the black handprint on my shoulder. It was real. The dampness was seeping into my skin. A cold, grave dirt cold. The fabric of my shirt was heavy with it. Rage, pure and hot, burned through the ice in my veins. It was a chemical reaction, a sudden and violent shift from prey to something else. Something cornered. Something with nothing left to lose. I had been listening. I had been hiding. I had been letting this thing, whatever it was, push me around in my own fucking house. It had touched me. It had left its filth on me. No more. The thought was a single, clean shard of glass in my mind. No more. I turned my back on the mirror, on the empty room, on the phantom touch. I strode out of the bathroom, down the short hallway. My gaze was fixed on the bedroom door. The gouges in the wood seemed to mock me. That was the source. The scratching. The sound from the wall in the bathroom a few minutes ago. The reflection in the mirror had pointed. Walls. It all came from inside the walls. I had been treating a symptom, jumping at shadows when the disease was growing in the bones of the building. I wouldn't run. Where would I go? Back to the life I fled? To face the judgment I deserved? This was my penance then. This house. This thing. Fine. But I wouldn't go down whimpering in a corner. If I was going to hell, I would kick the goddamn door in. I descended the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. My shoulder throbbed with a dull, distant fire, but the adrenaline was a powerful anesthetic. The dark, wet patch on the living room floor caught my eye. I didn't skirt around it this time. I walked right through it. The wood was slick and cold under my feet. The smell of turned earth and decay billowed up, a scent I was becoming sickeningly familiar with. There was a door next to the kitchen that led down to a small, stone-walled cellar. I had only glanced in there once when I first arrived. It was damp and smelled of spiders and stone dust. It was where the previous owners had left the old tools. I yanked the door open and flicked the bare bulb on. A weak, yellow light illuminated a set of steep wooden steps. I went down. The air grew colder, heavier. Rusted garden implements hung from nails on the wall. A lawnmower sat under a dusty tarp. And there, leaning against a stack of old tires, was a crowbar. Long, heavy, its red paint chipped to reveal the dark gray steel beneath. It was perfect. A tool for prying things open, for breaking things apart. I grabbed it. The weight of it in my hand was satisfying. Solid. Real. A piece of the physical world I could use against the impossible. I held it in my good hand, the curved end pointing forward like a talon. My knuckles were white. I didn't waste time. I went back up the stairs, the crowbar a heavy pendulum at my side. Through the kitchen, through the living room, my bare feet leaving damp, dirty footprints on the floorboards. I took the main staircase again. My purpose, a cold, hard stone in my gut. I was no longer afraid. The part of my brain that processed fear had been overloaded, short-circuited. All that was left was a raw, white-hot need for confrontation, for destruction. I stood before the bedroom door, the one with the scratches. I pushed it open. The room was as I had left it. The bed was unmade. The window looked out onto the gray, unforgiving morning. I walked to the wall opposite the bed, the one that shared a spine with the bathroom. This was it. This was where the scratching had been loudest. I pressed my ear against the floral-patterned wallpaper. Silence. The scratching was gone. My heart, which had been a steady, angry drum, faltered for a beat. Had I imagined it all? Was I just a man attacking his own house with a crowbar because of a faulty reflection and a dirty shirt? No! The mark was still on my shoulder. The puddle was still on the floor. I stayed there, my ear pressed to the wall. The silence wasn't empty, it was thick. Attentive. Then I heard it. It wasn't scratching. It was a hum. A low, deep thrumming, like a massive refrigerator running somewhere far away. It was a sound so low it was almost a feeling. A vibration that traveled through the plaster and into the bones of my skull. I pulled back from the wall and stared at it. The pattern on the wallpaper, a faded mess of pink and green flowers, seemed to writhe in the low light. My eyes were playing tricks on me. But then, I saw it. A large patch of the wall, about 4 feet wide and 6 feet high, was moving. The movement was tiny. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor. The wallpaper in that section shivered, the little pink flowers trembling as if in a breeze. The low hum grew a fraction of a decibel louder. It was coming from in there, like a transformer, a generator, an engine running inside my wall. I watched, mesmerized, my knuckles bloodless on the crowbar. The anger in my chest was being slowly replaced by a much older, colder feeling. The hum vibrated up through the floorboards. into the soles of my feet. Then the motion changed. The patch of wallpaper began to swell. Slowly, deliberately. It pushed outward, the paper stretching, the floral pattern distorting. The plaster beneath must have been flexible, like rubber. It bulged out a few inches, held the shape for a long, agonizing second, and then, just as slowly, it receded. It pulled back in, sinking slightly past the surface of the rest of the wall before swelling out again. Inhale, exhale. My mind refused it. My eyes saw it, my ears heard the low drone, my feet felt the vibration, but my brain screamed that it was wrong. Walls don't do that. Walls are plaster and wood and nails. They are static. They are dead. This wall was breathing. The smell hit me then. The same smell from the puddle, from the handprint, but 100 times stronger. Not just damp earth. It was the smell of a crypt, of rot, of meat left too long in the sun. It poured out of the breathing wall in waves, a foul, organic stench that coated the back of my throat and made my eyes water. This wasn't a ghost. This wasn't a memory. This was a thing. A living thing. And I was inside of it. The fear came back, a tidal wave of it, so immense it almost dropped me to my knees. It was a biological dread, the instinctual terror of a mouse realizing it's not in a house, but in the belly of a snake. Every rational thought shattered. I was a trespasser, a foreign body, a meal. A raw, guttural noise ripped out of my throat, half scream, half sob. The sound of a trapped animal. My rationality was gone, burned away by the sight of that heaving, stinking wall. I was running on pure, primal instinct. Fight. Fuck you. The words tore through the air, hoarse and broken. I raised the crowbar high over my head, both hands gripping the cold steel. The pain in my shoulder was a supernova, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered but the rhythmic, grotesque rise and fall of the wall in front of me. I put every ounce of my weight, my rage, my terror into the swing. I lunged forward screaming and drove the pointed end of the crowbar directly into the center of the bulge as it swelled to its peak. The sound was not the crack of plaster or the splintering of wood. It was a wet, tearing sound. Schlurp. Like a knife punching through a side of beef. The crowbar sank in, almost to my hands, with a sickening lack of resistance. For a second there was silence. Then the wall erupted. A geyser of hot, black fluid shot from the hole. It wasn't a splash, it was a pressurized jet. It hit me square in the chest and face. I was blinded. The liquid was thick like crude oil but warm like fresh blood. It filled my open mouth, slick and vile, tasting of iron and soil and something else, something metallic and foul. It covered my eyes, my hair, my clothes. The sheer force of it knocked me stumbling backward. I slipped on the floor, which was now slick with the stuff, and fell hard on my hip. I scrambled back on my hands and knees, clawing at my eyes, spitting and gagging. The stench was overwhelming, a physical presence in the room. I finally wiped my eyes clear and looked up. The crowbar was still embedded in the wall, waggling slightly. From the wound I had made, the black liquid was no longer spraying but pouring. A thick, steady stream that ran down the wallpaper and pooled on the floor, merging with the puddle already there. I got to my feet, my body shaking uncontrollably. I stumbled back until my legs hit the bed frame, never taking my eyes off the hole. I had to see. I had to know what I had done, what I had stabbed. I stared into the gash in my wall. Where there should have been insulation, studs, and drywall, there was only a cavity. And inside that cavity, glistening and wet with its own dark fluid, was a mass. It wasn't a pipe, it wasn't wiring. It was a pulsing, twitching organ of black, fungal flesh. It was veined with lines that were a deeper, more purple shade of black, like diseased blood vessels. They throbbed with a weak, sluggish rhythm, out of sync with the wall's breathing, which had now stopped. The flesh around the crowbar's entry point was torn and mangled, quivering in small, spastic jerks. It was slowly, sluggishly leaking the warm, stinking fluid onto the floor. My stomach heaved. I had not broken a wall. I had ruptured a membrane. I had stabbed something's lung. Or its heart. Or something for which there was no name. I had pierced the organ of my house. I stumbled backward, my hands flailing for a balance I couldn't find. My hip hit the floorboards with a dull, wet smack. The black fluid was everywhere. It was a film over my eyes, a nauseating coat on my tongue. I coughed, a thick, retching spasm that brought more of the vile taste up from my throat. I spit, but it was like trying to spit out oil. It just smeared. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, smearing the slickness, the grit, the warmth. My vision cleared in streaks. The crowbar stood jammed in the wall, a monument to my stupidity. It twitched as the dark flesh behind it spasmed. A thick, unhurried river of the black liquid oozed from the wound I had made, down the floral wallpaper, and into the growing pool on the floor. The thing I had stabbed was still alive. Its slow, rhythmic leaking was the proof. The air was a heavy blanket of its smell, turned soil and iron. A butcher shop in a heat wave. I pushed myself up, using the foot of the bed for leverage. My body shook. Not from cold. It was a deeper tremor. From the wires inside me, the ones that screamed at me to get out. Get out now. But running was not an option. Fleeing is what got me here. The crowbar was a lost cause, embedded in that organ. I needed something else, something sharp. My brain, seizing on a single practical thought in a sea of madness, gave me an answer. The kitchen. The knife block. I turned and moved. My bare feet made sucking sounds on the floor, peeling themselves free of the black ichor with every step. I didn't look back at the wounded wall. I didn't need to. I could feel it behind me. Or maybe I could feel the whole house, a single vast organism, its attention now fixed on the microbe that had caused it pain. Out of the bedroom. Down the main staircase. My hand, slick with the fluid, slipped on the banister. I caught myself, my chest slamming against the wood. I left a thick, black smear on the railing. I kept going, my breath coming in ragged pulls. Each step down felt like a descent deeper into the creature's gullet. The living room was darker than before. The weak morning light seemed to be absorbed by the walls themselves. I passed the puddle I had walked through earlier. It was larger now, fed by the runoff from upstairs. It wasn't a puddle anymore. It was a slick. I entered the kitchen. The linoleum felt cold and blessedly solid under my filth-caked feet. I left a trail of black footprints, a path marking my contamination. My eyes went to the counter, to the wooden block next to the toaster. I lurched toward it, my movements clumsy, uncoordinated. I bypassed the smaller paring knives, my hand closing around the largest one, the chef's knife. Its handle was smooth, black plastic, solid. I pulled it free from the block. The long silver blade gleamed in the dim light. It was heavy. It was real. I held it in a white-knuckled grip, the edge facing away from me. This was better than the crowbar. Faster. More intimate. I stood there for a second, the knife in my hand, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space. Then the hum was joined by another sound. A whisper. It was faint, airy, like a draft through a keyhole. It came from the direction of the floor vents. Accident. My head snapped toward the sound. There was nothing, just the metal grate. Then, another sound, from behind me. A dry, scraping noise from the pantry door. And with it, a new word, spoken in the same bodiless way. Knock. I spun around, the knife held out in front of me. The pantry was closed. The house was playing with me, using its own anatomy to speak. A hiss came from the sink drain, a bubble of trapped air escaping the plumbing. Run! The words hung in the air, disconnected pieces of a puzzle my guilt-riddled mind was all too eager to solve. It clicked them together instantly, forging a sentence of condemnation. Because of the accident, I come knocking, you can't run. It wasn't a warning. It was a verdict, a pronouncement of sentence. My knuckles were bloodless on the handle of the knife. Fine, I wasn't going to run. The chorus of faint, scattered whispers died away, and for a moment, the only sound was my own ragged breathing. Then, a new voice emerged from the silence. It was different. It was clear. It was a woman's voice, and it did not come from a vent or a drain. It came from the archway that led back to the living room, as if someone were standing just out of sight. It was not a whisper. It was spoken. Don't listen to it. The voice was calm. It held no malice, only a kind of weary insistence. My heart hammered against my ribs. Was this her? The girl from the roadside? Had she come to personally escort me to hell? To tell me not to listen to the part of my brain that still screamed for survival? To give in? To accept what was coming? My jaw tightened. I gave a slow, deliberate nod into the empty space, an acceptance of terms. As if in response, the house answered. A deep, groaning sound came from the ceiling above me, the sound of immense timber straining under a colossal weight. The floor vibrated. A window pane in the living room gave a loud pop, not shattering, but shifting in its frame. It was a sound of constriction, of a cage being tightened. The house was squeezing. It was preparing. I walked out of the kitchen, the knife held low at my side. I moved through the archway and into the living room. My eyes went straight to the fireplace, to the dusty mantelpiece, to the small, tarnished silver frame I had placed there on my first day. The only picture. The one I had pulled from the newspaper clipping I couldn't bring myself to throw away. Her face. A high school portrait. I stared at it from across the room, her smile, the light in her eyes. The accusation. The groaning of the house intensified, a low-frequency thrum that made my teeth ache. The air grew heavy, pressing in on me. I saw the picture frame vibrate on the mantelpiece, shaking from the house's tremors. Then it moved. It didn't fall. It didn't slide. It shot off the mantelpiece, as if kicked. It flew across the room in a flat, horizontal arc, a silver blur against the gloom. It spun through the air with a soft whirring sound and clattered onto the floorboards not 3 feet in front of me. It landed face up. I stood frozen, my gaze locked on it. The groaning of the house subsided. The air was still. The only sounds were the thudding in my own chest and the slow, wet drip, drip, drip from the floor above. Slowly, as if my joints were filled with sand, I bent my knees. I crouched down, the knife still clutched in my hand, its tip hovering inches from the wooden floor. I looked at the face in the photograph. My mind had always supplied the details, judgmental glare, condemning smile, the face of my guilt. But now, seeing it so close, seeing it for what it was, the illusion shattered. My memory was a liar. Her eyes were not accusatory, they were wide. Too wide. The photographer had probably told her to smile. But the expression hadn't quite reached her eyes. There was a tension in them, a deer in the headlights look, and her mouth, the smile I had always seen as a smirk of damnation, was just a little too tight. It was the smile of someone trying to be polite while feeling deeply, terribly uncomfortable. The flash of the camera had caught it. The look of a person who senses something is wrong. A look of primal fear. And in that instant, everything shifted. A chasm opened up in my understanding. Knock, knock, knock. The rhythm that had tormented me for weeks. It wasn't random. It wasn't a threat. It was the beat. The beat of the song on the radio that night. The one I was drumming on the steering wheel right before the impact. It wasn't, I am here. It was, remember, run. The whisper from the drain. Not a taunt that my escape was futile. It was a command, an instruction, a plea. Don't listen to it. The clear, calm voice. It wasn't about me. It wasn't telling me to ignore my own survival instinct. It was telling me not to listen to the house, to the whispers in the vents, to the lies it was feeding me. The ghost of my victim wasn't haunting me. She was trapped here with me. She wasn't the monster. She was the first victim. And she had been trying to warn me. The realization hit me not like a thought, but like a physical blow. A gasp of air punched out of my lungs. The knife fell from my numb fingers, clattering on the floor beside the photograph. A coldness that had nothing to do with the night or the dampness flooded my veins. I had been so wrapped in my own deserved damnation that I couldn't see the real trap closing around me. I thought I was the sinner being punished. I was just the next meal. The moment the truth settled in my mind, the moment I understood. Bam! The front door slammed shut with the force of a car crash, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. Slam! The kitchen window followed, the wooden frame cracking. Thud! The back door. A rapid-fire succession of violent cracks and booms erupted from upstairs as every window was driven into its frame. The sounds were not of wind or pressure. They were deliberate. Malignant. Each one was a nail being hammered into a coffin. A final, deafening bang from the cellar door shook the very floor beneath my feet. And then, a new sound. A small sound, made impossibly loud in the sudden complete stillness. From the front door, the distinct metallic sound of a deadbolt sliding home. Click. The click was a small sound, a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence I had only just learned to read. The world went quiet. The groaning of the timbers stopped. The wet dripping from the ceiling ceased. The air settled. It was the silence of a held breath, the silence of a predator that has closed its jaws. I was on my knees on the floorboards. The tarnished silver frame lay beside my hand. Her face, the girl in the photograph, stared up past me at the ceiling. A face of fear, not accusation. She wasn't haunting me, she was warning me. And I had been too busy drowning in my own self-pity to listen. I scrambled backward, a crab-like motion of hands and feet. My back hit the leg of the sofa. I stopped, my chest heaving, my gaze locked on the front door. The deadbolt. A simple piece of metal, slid home. An impossible action. The knife I had dropped lay a few feet away, its blade catching a sliver of the weak light. A useless tool. You don't fight a prison with a knife. You don't stab a tomb. The house wasn't a place, it was a thing. A mouth. And it had just closed. My own guilt had been the key in the lock. It had drawn me here, made me blind, made me deaf. I thought the house was a mirror, reflecting my sin. It was a pitcher plant. I was just the fly, lured in by the sweet scent of my own decay. A sound returned to the world. It was not a whisper. It was not a groan. It was a soft, wet, pulling noise from upstairs. From the bedroom. From the wound I had made in the wall. The sound of a scab forming. My body moved without my consent. One leg straightened, then the other. I pushed myself up, my hand flat against the dusty couch fabric. I had to see. The need to know was a physical sickness, stronger than the fear. I turned away from the sealed front door and walked toward the stairs. My steps were slow, deliberate. Each footfall on the wood was a separate event. I placed my hand on the banister, the same spot where I had smeared the black fluid. It was gone. The wood was clean, dry. As I climbed, the air grew warmer, thick with a smell I was beginning to recognize. It was the smell of a butcher shop, and a freshly dug grave. Iron and earth. My feet found the upstairs landing. The hall was a tunnel of shadows. I crept toward the open doorway of the bedroom. The crowbar was still jammed in the wall, but it was being consumed. The dark, flesh-like substance had swollen around it. The gash I had torn now only a puckered seam. As I watched, two edges of the wound stretched toward each other, tiny black threads, like surgical sutures, sprouting from the surfaces and knitting together. They pulled the wound closed with a faint, moist, tearing sound. The thick black liquid had stopped flowing. The organism was healing itself. It was a thing of biology, an anatomy of wood and plaster and something else. Something living. I backed away from the doorway, my eyes scanning the hall. That's when I saw it. At the base of the wall, where the molding met the floorboards, a thin, black line had appeared. It was as fine as a strand of hair. As I watched, it thickened, it branched, a delicate fractal pattern spreading outward. A second line started from the corner of the ceiling, moving down the floor wallpaper like a crack in reverse. It was mold. A living, growing, black mold. I turned and stumbled back toward the stairs. My gaze fell into the living room below. It was happening there too. From every corner, every seam, the black filaments were emerging. They crept over the walls, across the floor, a lattice of slow-moving veins. It wasn't frantic. It was methodical. The steady, unhurried work of a spider spinning its web. The game was done. The house was no longer playing. It was feeding. A new panic, cold and sharp, pierced the fog of my terror. The windows. I lunged for the nearest one, the large pane that looked out onto the overgrown front yard. The black tendrils of mold were crawling up the frame, but the glass was still clear. I looked through it, desperate for the sight of the road, of another house, of anything. There was nothing. The world outside was gone. A thick, greasy, gray film coated the exterior of the glass, opaque and seamless. It looked like a layer of solidified fat. The house had secreted a cataract over its own eye, sealing me inside. I slammed my fist against the pane. The sound was a dull, meaty thud. The glass didn't even vibrate. It was like hitting a wall of solid rock. I tried the next window. The same. A gray, greasy membrane, blocking the view, blocking the light. The living room was now sinking into a deep twilight, the only illumination coming from the slivers of space not yet covered by the encroaching black web. The smell was stronger, a cloying organic odor that coated the back of my throat. The front door. The bolt. I threw myself against it, my shoulder hitting the solid wood. It didn't budge. Again. And again. It was useless. The wood felt rooted, as much a part of the foundation as the stone it was built on. The black filaments were crawling across the floor toward me, inches from my shoes. They moved with a visible creeping motion now. I could hear them. A sound so faint it was almost below the threshold of hearing. A dry, rustling, scratching hiss. The sound of a million tiny legs. My mind raced. a frantic animal in a cage. Kitchen. Back door. I spun and ran through the archway, my feet slipping on the floorboards. The kitchen was darker still. The window over the sink was a sheet of gray. The back door was a solid slab of shadows. The black filaments poured from the vents, from beneath the refrigerator, from the drain in the sink, converging on the center of the room. They were faster now. The web was closing. I was trapped. Truly trapped. My eyes darted around the living room, searching for a flaw, a mistake, a way out that the house had overlooked. The fireplace. A chimney. I ran to it, my hands gripping the mantelpiece. The photograph was still on the floor where it had landed. I looked up into the black throat of the chimney. A solid wall of greasy soot stared back at me. It looked like it had been bricked up for a century. My chest burned. There was nowhere to go. Upstairs was death. This floor was death. The house was a stomach, and the digestive acids were beginning to flow. Then I saw it. Under the main staircase. A low, narrow door, painted the same color as the wall. A door I hadn't even registered as functional. It was flush with the wall, with a small, black iron ring for a handle. The cellar. I had never opened it. The real estate agent said it was just a small, dirt-floored space for storage, prone to dampness. It was a choice. A place I had never been. An unknown. The only unknown left. The creeping black web was a foot away, its dry rustling growing louder. I didn't have time to think. I lunged across the remaining open space, my fingers closing around the cold iron ring. I pulled. The door resisted, its old wood swollen in the frame. I grunted, planting my feet, and threw my entire weight into it. With a loud crack and a groan of tortured hinges, the door swung inward, scraping against the floor. A wave of air washed over me. It was cold. It smelled of deep, wet earth, of rot, of things left in the dark for a very long time. It was the smell of a root cellar. It was the smell of a tomb. But it was a way out from here. Without a second glance, I pitched myself forward, through the opening and onto the steep wooden steps beyond. My foot missed the first step. I fell, tumbling down into the absolute, perfect blackness below. I landed with a jarring thud on a floor that wasn't wood. It was soft. Packed earth. I scrambled to my feet, my head spinning, and looked up. The doorway was a dim rectangle of gray light, framed in the crawling black web. I could see the tendrils beginning to curl over the threshold, starting their descent. I lurched back up the first few steps, grabbed the edge of the heavy door, and pulled it shut. It closed with a deep, final thump, plunging me into a darkness so complete it felt like a physical weight. Silence. I slumped against the rough wood of the door, my back pressed to it, my breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The rustling sound was gone. The smell of the house was gone. Here, there was only the cold and the damp and the rich smell of soil. I was safe. For a second, I felt an insane surge of victory. I had found a loophole, a blind spot. I slid down the door until I was sitting on the dirt floor, my head in my hands, just breathing. The only sound was the frantic drumming of my own heart. Then I heard another sound. It was not from the door behind me. It came from the darkness in front of me. A soft, wet sound. A quiet sob. My head snapped up. I stared into the blackness, my skin crawling. I wasn't alone. "Who's there?" The words were a croak. There was no answer, only another sob, this one joined by a second, faint whimper from another direction. My eyes, starved of all light, began to play tricks on me. Or maybe they were finally starting to work. A faint glow began to resolve out of the oppressive dark. It wasn't light. It was an absence of total blackness. A weak, internal luminescence, like foxfire on rotting wood. It came from the far side of the cellar. As my vision slowly, painfully adjusted, shapes began to emerge from the gloom. They were pale, vaguely human-shaped. One was huddled in a corner, its knees drawn to its chest. Another was slumped against a stone wall. Another lay on the floor. They were shimmering, their forms indistinct, their edges bleeding into the darkness around them. I could see more of them now. 10. 20. Dozens of them, packed into the small space. They were all silent, but for the soft, hopeless weeping. They glowed with a faint, sickly, bluish light. A new realization, colder and harder than any that had come before, settled into the pit of my stomach. The girl on the roadside. She wasn't an anomaly. She was just the most recent. These were the others. The ones who came before me. I hadn't found an escape. I had just locked myself in the pantry. My breathing was a machine, loud and broken in the thick, silent dark. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird throwing itself against its cage. My back was slick with sweat where it pressed against the cellar door. The wood was solid, a barrier. I had cheated it. I had found a flaw in its design, a corner of the stomach it couldn't reach. The thought was a flare of insane triumph in the black void of my panic. I was sitting on cold, packed earth, the smell of damp soil and subterranean rot filling my lungs. It was the smell of a grave, but it was better than the smell of the house. It was a clean death. Then the sound came, severing the thread of my relief. It was not a creak of wood or the hiss of the encroaching web. It was a sob, a soft, wet, human sound that cut through the darkness from somewhere in front of me. It was a sound of absolute, bottomless despair. My muscles locked, my blood ran cold, a freezing slurry in my veins. The air I had just sucked in seemed to solidify in my chest. I was not alone. The victory turned to ash in my mouth. I had not found a sanctuary. I had found someone else's prison cell. "Who's there?" My voice was a dry rasp, a stranger's voice. It was swallowed by the oppressive dark without an echo. The only answer was another sob, weaker this time, and then, from a different direction, a faint, shuddering whimper. My eyes, open wide and stinging, strained against the perfect black. They saw nothing. Then, slowly, like a developing photograph in a dark room of horrors, a light began to assert itself. It wasn't a light source. It was a property of the things themselves. A faint, internal glow, the color of spoiled milk under a blue moon. Forms began to resolve from the gloom. Pale, shimmering outlines, vaguely human. One was slumped in a far corner, a faint, blue-white shape with its head on its knees. Another was a smear of light against a stone foundation wall, its form barely coherent. A third lay stretched upon the dirt floor, a long, wavering phosphorescence. My eyes tracked from one to the next, my brain refusing to process the count. 10. 20. 3 dozen. The cellar was crowded. It was packed with these silent, glowing figures, a congregation of lost light. Their only sound was the soft, continuous, hopeless weeping that seemed to come from all of them, and none of them at once. My gaze scanned the collection of sorrows, and then it found her. She was near the front, separate from the others. The girl. The girl from the roadside, from the photograph. Her form was clearer than the rest, the memory of her still fresh. The torn fabric of her jacket, the way her hair fell across one shoulder. She looked at me, and there was no anger in her shimmering eyes. There was no accusation, no burning hatred for the man who had left her to die. There was only a profound, heartbreaking pity. It was the look a fellow prisoner gives a new arrival. The truth dry, a block of ice into my gut. The house didn't just consume you. It kept you. It collected souls like a child collecting dead insects in a jar. She wasn't the first, she was just the most recent acquisition. These were the others. The ones who came before me. The ones who had also run to this door, believing it was an escape. I hadn't found a loophole. I had just locked myself in the pantry. A flicker of movement drew my eye. One of the figures, an old man whose form was defined by the faint outline of a waistcoat and high collar from a century past, began to stir. He moved with an agonizing slowness, his every gesture seeming to take a tremendous effort. His glowing, translucent arm lifted. The light from the other figures passed right through it. He raised a wavering finger and pointed. Not at me. Up. He was pointing at the low ceiling of the cellar, at the thick wooden floorboards of the living room just above my head. My head snapped up. I stared into the darkness above, at the thin cracks between the heavy beams. At first I saw nothing. Then, a single, dark bead formed on the wood. It swelled, glistening in the faint light from the captive souls, like a drop of crude oil. It elongated, a thick strand of black saliva, and then it let go. It landed on the dirt floor a few feet from me with a soft, wet plop. Another bead formed. And another. All along the seams of the floorboards, the thick black liquid was beginning to push through. It wasn't just dripping, it was seeping, bleeding through the very fibers of the wood. The faint smell of iron and earth returned, but it was stronger now, heavier, laced with an underlying stench of chemical decay. The house was sweating. It was secreting its digestive fluids, dissolving the barrier between itself and its meal. The weeping in the cellar grew softer, as if in reverence for the process. A new, more immediate fear took hold of me, a primal terror of being dissolved, of being unmade. I crawled backward on my hands and knees, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, on the black ichor that now began to rain down in a slow, steady drizzle. The dirt floor around me was becoming freckled with dark, wet spots. The girl's spirit moved. She didn't walk. Her feet didn't touch the packed earth. She drifted forward, an unsteady glide, leaving a faint trail of light in her wake. The terrible symphony of sobs quieted as she approached. She stopped a foot in front of me, her sorrowful eyes locked on mine. She was trying to tell me something. The gurgling of the house above was the only sound. Slowly, like the old man, she raised her hand. It was a girl's hand, small and delicate, yet it seemed to carry the weight of the world. She reached out and placed her palm flat against my chest, over my heart. There was no warmth, no pressure, just a patch of cold. A specific, localized cold, like a piece of dry ice pressed to my shirt. It leached the heat from my body. And then the world fractured. It wasn't a thought. It was an assault. Images, sounds, sensations fired into my brain like shotgun pellets. The squeal of tires on wet asphalt. The spiderweb crack of a windshield. The smell of gasoline and rain. The blare of a pop song from a cheap radio. Red and blue lights strobing against wet trees. My face, for a split second, reflected in her dying eyes, a mask of terror. And then a new sensation, one that wasn't mine. A feeling of lightness. Release. Followed immediately by a violent, physical jerk. A hook in her soul. A brutal, irresistible pull, dragging her away from the wreckage, over the dark fields, through trees and fences, straight toward the silhouette of this god-forsaken house. It was not a haunting. It was a kidnapping. She had been torn from her own death and brought here. She wasn't my ghost. She was the house's prisoner. Her desperate warnings, the song on the radio, the knocking, were not threats. They were echoes. They were the only words she had left. This happened to me. Don't let it happen to you. The vision shattered. I was back in the cellar, on my knees, gasping. The girl's hand was still on my chest. Her message had been delivered. A drop of the black liquid from above hit my other hand, the one planted on the dirt floor. A hiss, sharp and violent, like water hitting a hot skillet. Pain exploded in my hand. It was a clean, sharp chemical agony. It wasn't heat. It was an anti-cold. An energy that didn't burn but unmade. Acrid smoke, smelling of my own cooking flesh, billowed up. I screamed, a raw, animal sound, and yanked my hand back, clutching it to my chest. The drop had eaten a hole through the back of my work glove. I ripped it off, my heart seizing in my throat. I stared at the back of my hand. The skin at the center of the impact point was gone. But there wasn't blood. There wasn't raw meat. The edges of the small circular wound were cauterized black. And in the center, the flesh itself, it was changing. It was becoming sheer, like smoked glass. I held it up in the ghostly blue light. I could see the faint, dark lines of the metacarpal bones beneath the skin. I could see the web of my own veins, pulsing faintly. The skin around the wound was losing its color, its opacity, turning a pale, shimmering white. The edges of my hand began to glow with the same sickly, wavering luminescence as the figures packed into the darkness around me. The house wasn't just going to kill me. It was going to absorb me. It was going to add my light to its collection. The process had already begun. The scream tore from my throat, a ragged, useless sound. I scrambled backward, away from the black drop, cradling my hand to my chest. The pain was not a fire. It was an unmaking, a cold, fizzing void where my flesh had been. I fumbled with the cuff of my other glove, pulling it off with my teeth, and tried to wipe at the wound. It was like trying to wipe away a hole. The viscous black fluid had already vanished, soaked into me, and the wound wasn't bleeding. It was expanding. The small, neat circle of nothingness grew wider, its cauterized black ring eating into healthy skin. The flesh within that ring was becoming crystalline. I could see the pearly white of the bone beneath, not as if through a wound, but as if through a smoky window. My skin was losing its substance, its very idea of being skin. It was turning into something else. The sickly corpse-like glow that emanated from the figures around me now had a new source. It was coming from me, from my own hand. The collected, sorrowful weeping from the dozens of spirits had ceased. The air was now filled with a different kind of quiet. Not of peace, but of anticipation. They were watching me. Their faint, shimmering forms were all turned in my direction, their glowing eyes fixed on my dissolving hand. There was no pity in their gaze now, no shared misery. There was only a calm, familiar recognition. This was the next step. They had all taken it. My back hit the damp earth of the far wall. I had nowhere else to crawl. My frantic gaze darted around the cellar, searching for a weapon, an escape, a weakness. My eyes landed on the thick wooden support beam in the center of the room. It was the pillar that held up the weight of the world above. And it was changing. It started at the base. The grain of the thick oak post began to soften, the hard lines blurring. It was not rotting, it was rearranging. The wood fibers seemed to go pliant, twisting on one another like massive bundles of muscle. A deep, wet groaning sound echoed in the cellar, not the protest of stressed wood, but the sound of something organic shifting its weight. The pillar was contracting, swelling, its surface turning from rough-hewn timber to a slick, fibrous membrane that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat. A dark stain spread upward from the floor, not like moisture, but like a bruise forming in time-lapse. The black, wet mold that festered in the corners of the cellar was now climbing this central column, covering it, lining it, becoming a part of it. It looked less like a support beam, and more like a throat. A massive, vertical esophagus plunged into the heart of the foundation, its interior coated with a layer of glistening, digestive blackness. The dripping from the ceiling intensified. The thick, black ichor no longer fell in discrete drops, but rained down in slick, oily sheets, soaking the packed earth floor. I felt a change beneath me. The solid ground, the one constant thing in this nightmare, was becoming soft. It yielded under my weight. I pushed myself up, trying to get to my feet, and my boots sank an inch into the dirt. It had the consistency of wet clay. I took a clumsy step, and my foot sank to the ankle. A thick, sucking sound followed as I pulled it free. The floor was liquefying. The entire cellar floor was transforming into a dark, churning quagmire of mud and viscous slime. It wasn't just wet, it was active. It tugged at me. A slow, undeniable current was pulling everything toward the center of the room, toward the base of that ghastly, pulsing pillar. The glowing figures were also moving. They were no longer stationary mourners. They were being drawn by the same current, their faint forms stretching and distorting as they were pulled across the slurry. The old man with the waistcoat, the slump-shouldered shape in the corner, they all slid helplessly toward the central gullet. They offered no resistance. They had none left to give. They were just memories, nutrients being recalled for the final stage of digestion. My own body was failing me. I clawed at the dissolving earth, my fingers sinking into the cold muck. Each time I tried to pull myself toward the wall, the floor seemed to lose more of its integrity, dragging me back 2 feet for every one I gained. The luminous decay was spreading up my arm now. My wrist was translucent, the twin bones of my forearm visible as faint, dark lines within a column of pale, shimmering light. The house was claiming me, piece by piece, even before it swallowed me whole. I was no longer just a meal, I was becoming part of the stomach. Panic gave way to a cold, stark certainty. There was no escape. The cellar door I had barricaded was an illusion of safety, the entrance to the abattoir. Every choice I had made since setting foot on this property had been the wrong one, a step deeper into the trap. My eyes found her again. The girl. Her shimmering form was being pulled along with the others, a ribbon of light in the dark. She was closer now, her sad, knowing eyes fixed on mine. The vision she had forced upon me burned behind my lids, the hook in her soul, the brutal abduction that had dragged her here. She hadn't been haunting me. She hadn't been punishing me. She had been screaming a warning in the only language she had left, the language of our shared trauma. The sound of the song, the frantic knocking, it was her last memory, played on a loop. This is how I was caught. See the hook. Don't let it catch you. And I, lost in the prison of my own guilt, had heard an accusation instead of an alarm. I had been so convinced I was being haunted for my sin that I couldn't see I was being warned by a fellow victim. The profound, crushing weight of that final failure was heavier than the house itself. It wasn't just that I was going to die. It was that I had died a fool, deaf to the one voice that tried to save me. The mire was up to my knees now, its pull irresistible. I stopped fighting it. My strength was gone. The light in my arm was brighter, my hand and forearm now a ghostly appendage I no longer recognized as my own. I let the current take me, sliding me across the churning floor toward the central pillar. I was just a few feet from her now, our paths converging at the maw. I looked directly at her, at the faint shape of her face, the shimmering memory of her hair. There was no more time for screams, no more breath for words. With the last dregs of my will, a will that was no longer about survival but about a single, desperate need to acknowledge the truth, I moved my lips. No sound came out, only the shape of the silent apology in the gloom. I'm sorry. Her form seemed to flicker, to brighten for a single incandescent moment. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time, the endless pity in them was replaced by something else. A flicker of simple, sad understanding. A shared peace in the final, absolute defeat. Then the floor gave way. There was no sensation of falling. There was only a total, violent immersion. The world vanished into a crushing, suffocating mass. It was not liquid. It was not solid. It was a thick, organic presence that filled my mouth, my nose, my eyes, pressing in from all sides at once. The light from my own dissolving body was extinguished. The faint glows of the other souls vanished. There was only the pressure and the thick, cloying taste of damp earth and chemical decay. My consciousness, the very thing that was me, was being squeezed, dissolved, unmade. In the final microsecond, before everything went black, one last image flashed, not a memory, but a live feed from another part of the organism. I was looking up, through the house itself. I saw the living room. It was placid, clean. Dust motes danced in a single, sharp shaft of late afternoon sunlight cutting through the window. The floorboards were polished. The air was still. Then, a metallic clink. The small brass flap of the mail slot in the front door lifted. A piece of paper, bright and glossy, slid through the opening. It hovered in the air for a moment before fluttering down, landing gently on the clean wooden floor. It was a flyer. From a real estate agency. A picture of the house was on the front, pristine and welcoming under a cheerful blue sky. For sale, the headline read, "A place to start anew."